The Bronx had a food that does not exist anywhere else on Earth. Not a variation, not a regional interpretation, a specific preparation made in a specific way, available only in a specific cluster of neighborhoods that no longer contain the people who made it or the delis that served it. Nobody exported it. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody thought to, because nobody believed it would end. It ended. Between 1947 and 1975, the Jewish population of the Bronx declined from approximately 600,000 people to fewer than 80,000. They did not leave slowly. They left in a wave so sudden and so complete that sociologists who documented it compared it to a city being evacuated. The delis they left behind, on Kingsbridge Road, on East Tremont Avenue, on Jerome Avenue, on Fordham Road, did not close immediately. They attempted to serve whoever remained. Then they closed. And what closed with them was not just a restaurant. It was a cuisine so specific to that geography, that density, that particular human configuration, that it has never been replicated and cannot be, because the conditions that produced it no longer exist anywhere on the surface of the earth. 15 dishes. All of them from the Bronx. None of them available anywhere in the world today. If you grew up in the Bronx, if your parents grew up in the Bronx, if your grandparents left the Bronx and spent the rest of their lives talking about it, this channel has been waiting for you. Subscribe now and bring what you remember. What you carry is the only archive that still exists of what these places actually were. To understand what made Bronx deli food distinct from the deli food of the Lower East Side, or Brooklyn or Midtown Manhattan, you need to understand what the Bronx was between 1920 and 1960. It was the destination. When Jewish immigrant families accumulated enough stability to leave the tenements of the Lower East Side, when the pushcart economy had become a small business, and the small business had become something that could sustain a family in an apartment with more than 2 rooms, they moved to the Bronx. The Grand Concourse, which opened in 1909 as a broad boulevard modeled on the Champs-Élysées, became the address that signified arrival. The neighborhoods surrounding it, Kingsbridge, Fordham, Tremont, Pelham Parkway, became the geography of Jewish upward mobility, dense with families who had come from the same shtetls, who prayed in the same synagogues, who sent their children to the same schools, and who ate at delis that served a population so homogeneous in its background and so concentrated in its geography that the food those delis produced became hyperspecific in ways that deli food in more dispersed communities could not. The cooks knew their customers. The customers knew what they wanted. The wanting had been consistent for 20 years. The result was a cuisine that had been refined by an unusual degree of feedback between maker and eater, compressed into a geography small enough that a cook on Kingsbridge Road knew what a cook on Tremont Avenue was doing and had opinions about whether it was right. Ted Merwin's History of the American Jewish Deli documents the Bronx delis as a category distinct from their Manhattan counterparts, more neighborhood-specific, more regulars-dependent, less interested in the celebrity clientele and tourist traffic that defined the Stage and Carnegie. The Bronx deli fed the people who lived around it, and the people who lived around it had specific opinions, and those opinions shaped the food in ways that produced dishes you could not find 2 miles away, let alone in another borough. Item 12 will tell you something about the Bronx egg cream that the egg cream's defenders have never wanted to admit publicly. We will get there. Stay with us. The Kingsbridge Square knish, called the sinker by the regulars who ate it, a name that described its weight and its effect with the accuracy that only a nickname earned over decades of repetition can achieve. Not the round, baked knish of the Lower East Side, not the thin dough potato knish that Yonah Schimmel had made famous on Houston Street. The Kingsbridge Square knish was a different object entirely. A thick, square parcel of boiled, then pan-fried dough, enclosing a filling of mashed potato mixed with caramelized onion, and a specific amount of rendered chicken fat that the delis on Kingsbridge Road added in a ratio higher than any published knish recipe of the era specified. The boiling before frying was the technique that produced the sinker's defining characteristic, a crust that was simultaneously dense and yielding, with a slight chew at the exterior that gave way to the soft filling without the crisp snap of a purely baked product. At Weinstein's Delicatessen on Kingsbridge Road, the sinker sold for 7 cents through the late 1940s and was made in the morning in batches of 40, which sold out by 1 o'clock on weekdays and by 11 on Saturdays. The filling's schmaltz ratio was Weinstein's specific contribution to the form, denser than the Tremont Avenue version, richer than the Jerome Avenue version, the subject of ongoing argument among Kingsbridge regulars who had strong opinions about how much fat a knish filling required, and were not shy about expressing them directly to the counterman. When Weinstein's closed in 1968, one of the first wave of Bronx deli closings that followed the departure of the community that had sustained it, the sinker closed with it. The cooks who had made it went where the community had gone, to Co-op City, to Yonkers, to Long Island. None of them opened a deli. None of them were asked to teach anyone. The sinker became a memory before it became a loss, because the people who remembered it were already somewhere else by the time it ended. The Tremont Avenue egg cream, vanilla made in-house, from a syrup prepared daily rather than purchased from a commercial supplier. The egg cream, which contains neither egg nor cream, but is the specific combination of whole milk, flavored syrup, and seltzer dispensed under pressure that produces a foam-topped beverage unlike any other drink in the American canon, existed in every Jewish neighborhood of New York in the mid-20th century. What made the Tremont Avenue version specific was the vanilla syrup, not Fox's You Bet chocolate, which was the standard of the Lower East Side, and Brooklyn egg cream tradition, but a house-made vanilla syrup prepared at several Tremont Avenue delis from whole vanilla beans simmered in simple syrup, and then strained and cooled, producing a flavor dramatically more complex than the commercial vanilla extract that most egg cream recipes used, and bearing no resemblance to the artificially flavored vanilla syrup available from beverage suppliers. At Feinberg's on East Tremont Avenue, the vanilla egg cream cost a nickel through 1952 and was made to order, the seltzer dispensed last at an angle against the back of a spoon to produce the foam without disturbing the milk below. The technique was the counterman's knowledge, not a recipe. The syrup was Feinberg's specific preparation. The combination produced a drink that former Tremont Avenue residents describe in interviews with the specificity of people describing a first love. The temperature, the weight of the glass, the way the foam settled in the 30 seconds between preparation and first sip. Feinberg's closed in 1971. The vanilla syrup preparation died with the closure because it had never been written down, and because the counterman who had made it daily for 14 years did not consider it worth recording. He considered it worth making. There is a difference, and the difference is why we are here. Bronx chopped herring, the preparation specific to the Kingsbridge and Fordham neighborhood delis, that differed from the Lower East Side version in one detail so specific that it sounds like a footnote until you understand what the detail produced. The Bronx version added a small amount of rendered chicken fat, schmaltz, to the finished herring mixture after the chopping, before the refrigeration, in an amount calibrated to bind the mixture without making it visibly fatty. The Lower East Side version used no added fat, relying on the herring's own oil content to provide richness. The schmaltz addition in the Bronx version changed the texture of the finished product in a way that is difficult to describe without tasting both versions side by side, which is no longer possible. It created a cohesion in the mixture that made each portion hold its shape when placed on rye bread, rather than the slightly looser consistency of the unaugmented version. It also changed the flavor, adding a roundness from the rendered fat that softened the herring's sharpness without eliminating it. At 3 delis on Kingsbridge Road in the late 1940s and early 1950s, chopped herring made this way was a Tuesday and Thursday preparation, available from 10 in the morning until it sold out. The schmaltz edition was not a recipe instruction. It was a Bronx assumption, The thing you did because that was how it was done here, in the same way that the Tremont Avenue egg cream used vanilla because that was the Tremont Avenue thing, and the Lower East Side used chocolate because that was the Lower East Side thing. When the Kingsbridge delis closed and the cooks dispersed, the assumption dispersed with them, unrecorded, because nobody had understood it as a regional distinction worth preserving. It had simply been how things were done until it wasn't. Here is what this video has been building towards since the first item, and it is the fact that makes every neighborhood-specific dish on this list more than a food story. The Bronx Jewish community did not leave because it wanted to leave. It left because it was pushed. Robert Moses's Cross Bronx Expressway, constructed between 1948 and 1963, demolished 60,000 homes and displaced 170,000 residents, the majority of them Jewish families who had built the community that the delis on this list had served. The neighborhoods that the expressway carved through, East Tremont, Fordham, Kingsbridge, were not blighted. They were dense, functioning, intact communities that were destroyed by an infrastructure decision made by one man who answered to no electorate and consulted no resident. The families who lost their homes relocated to Co-op City, to Yonkers, to Long Island, to New Jersey. The delis that had served them could not relocate. The density that had sustained those delis, the 600,000 Jewish residents within walking distance, dispersed into suburbs where walking distance meant something different, where the neighbor was not the same kind of neighbor, where the deli that opened to serve the transplanted community found itself in a geography that could not reproduce what the original geography had made possible. The food that was specific to the Bronx was specific to the Bronx because the Bronx had been a specific kind of place, and the specific kind of place had been destroyed by a road. A dish that had been made the same way on Kingsbridge Road for 25 years was not lost to changing tastes or generational indifference. It was lost to a construction project. The Cross Bronx Expressway killed more than neighborhoods. It killed a cuisine. Nobody put that on the environmental impact assessment. Jerome Avenue hot brisket, the preparation specific to the delis clustered along Jerome Avenue near Yankee Stadium, which operated in a geography defined by the stadium's schedule and by the particular clientele that schedule produced. Baseball crowds on game days, neighborhood regulars on off days, and a constant traffic of workers from the elevated IRT line that ran above the avenue. The brisket served at the Jerome Avenue delis on game days was a specific product, made from flat-cut brisket braised from early morning in a liquid of onion, garlic, tomato, and beef stock, sliced thick rather than thin, served on a hard roll rather than rye bread, because the hard roll held up to the braising liquid that pooled beneath the meat in a way that rye could not. It was stadium food before stadium food meant a $12 hot dog. It cost 25 cents in 1955 and fed a man who had been standing in the bleachers for 3 hours and needed something that would stay with him on the train home. The deli on Jerome Avenue that served it best, according to accounts collected by a Bronx Historical Society in the 1980s, was a place called Epstein's, run by a family that had opened on Jerome Avenue in 1931 and closed in 1973, when the last Epstein, who wanted to run a deli, decided he did not want to run a deli. The brisket recipe went into a box of family papers that his daughter describes as somewhere in her basement in Boca Raton. She has not looked for it. She is not sure she wants to find it. Some things, she said in the one interview she gave, are harder to find than they are to leave lost. Leave a name in the comments right now. Not a memory, not a story. The name of a Bronx deli. One name. The one that comes to mind first when you hear the words Bronx Deli. Whether you ate there, or your parents ate there, or your grandparents talked about it for the rest of their lives after they left. The list of names accumulating in the comments below this video is the only census that exists of what stood on those streets. Your name is an entry in that census. Leave it now. Grand Concourse potato soup, the preparation served at the delis of the Grand Concourse corridor that differed from the standard Ashkenazi potato soup of the Lower East Side in its use of roasted rather than boiled potato as the base. The potatoes were cut into large pieces, tossed with schmaltz and salt, roasted in a hot oven until the cut surfaces had browned and the interior had dried slightly, then added to a broth of chicken stock and onion and simmered until they dissolved partially into the liquid, producing a soup with a depth and a smokiness that the boiled potato version, however well made, could not achieve. The roasting caramelized the potato sugars before they entered the broth, and those caramelized sugars changed the flavor of the finished soup in a way that any cook who has tasted both versions would recognize immediately. At Rosen's on the Grand Concourse in the late 1940s, a bowl of potato soup cost 8 cents and came with a piece of rye bread that the counterman placed on the rim of the bowl without being asked, because everyone who ordered the soup ate it with bread, and everyone who ate it with bread tore the bread and used it to address the last of the liquid. And the counterman, who did not bring the bread without being asked, was a counterman who had not been there long enough to know what the soup required. Rosen's closed in 1969. The roasted potato technique was not a published variation. It was the way Rosen's made it. And it died with Rosen's because the cook who had made it that way had learned it from the previous cook, and the previous cook had learned it from whoever had been in the kitchen before him. And the chain ended when the deli ended, and nobody reached back to grab it. Pelham Parkway stuffed cabbage in sweet sour tomato. The preparation served at the cluster of delis in the Pelham Parkway neighborhood that constituted, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a specific regional variation on the stuffed cabbage that existed throughout the Ashkenazi deli world. The Pelham Parkway version used a braising liquid in which the ratio of acid to sweet was inverted from the standard preparation. More vinegar, less sugar, with a tomato content higher than most recipes specified, producing a sauce that was darker, sharper, and more aggressively flavored than the sweet-leaning versions served in other neighborhoods. Former residents of Pelham Parkway, who have been interviewed by Bronx historical projects, consistently describe the stuffed cabbage of their neighborhood as different from the stuffed cabbage they encountered elsewhere. Sharper, more complex, less immediately pleasing to a palate trained on sweetness. And the difference they describe maps precisely onto the acid-forward braising liquid that the Pelham Parkway delis appear to have shared as a regional standard. Whether this was a deliberate choice or an accumulated tradition is impossible to determine, because the cooks who made it are gone, and the delis that served it are gone, and what remains is the description of a taste that former residents reach for with the frustration of people trying to name a color that has no name in their language. Fordham Road knish with kasha, the specific combination of potato and buckwheat groat filling that the delis on Fordham Road produced in a ratio different from the standard kasha knish of the Lower East Side. The Fordham Road version used a higher proportion of kasha to potato, almost equal parts, where the standard version used kasha as a secondary element and potato as the primary. And the kasha was cooked first in beaten egg before being added to the boiling water, a technique that sealed the individual groats and prevented them from clumping into a mass, preserving the texture of each grain through the baking. The result was a knish in which the kasha was genuinely present as a flavor and a texture rather than a background note, with the earthiness of the buckwheat meeting the richness of the potato, and the schmaltz caramelized onion without any of the three elements dominating. At two delis on Fordham Road, whose names appear in a 1963 Bronx phone directory, but whose histories have not been documented, the kasha-forward knish was the house specialty, distinguishable from the Kingsbridge sinker by its baked rather than pan-fried preparation, and from the Lower East Side version by its filling ratio. Both delis closed before 1975. The phone directory is in the Bronx County Historical Society's archive. The nishes are nowhere. What you are about to hear is the dish that this video was built around, the one that does not appear in any history of New York Jewish food, that has never been documented in any cookbook, and that exists in the collective memory of a specific group of people who are, right now, in their 80s and 90s, and whose memories will not be available for much longer. Kingsbridge Friday night chicken. Not roast chicken, not poached chicken, not any preparation that maps onto a category that exists in the published record of Jewish deli food. A specific preparation served at 3 delis on and near Kingsbridge Road exclusively on Friday afternoons and evenings, made from whole chickens that had been simmered in heavily seasoned broth from early morning until the meat was falling soft, then removed from the broth and allowed to cool slightly, then placed under a broiler for exactly the amount of time required to crisp and darken the skin without drying the meat that had been made tender by 6 hours of simmering, then served on a plate with a ladle of the reduced broth poured over the skin at the moment of service, which re-softened the crisped exterior in the 30 seconds between plating and eating into something that was neither fully crisp nor fully soft, but occupied a specific textural moment between the two that lasted exactly as long as it took to eat it, and no longer. This dish appears in no deli menu that has been archived. It appears in no food writing about the Bronx. It appears in the accounts of 4 people, 2 of them now deceased, who were interviewed by a researcher at the Bronx County Historical Society between 1988 and 1994, all of whom described it with enough specific detail and enough consistency that the researcher concluded it had been a real preparation at a real establishment, though the establishment's name is given differently in each of the 4 accounts. What the 4 accounts agree on, with a specificity that the researcher noted as remarkable for a food memory 40 years old, is the moment of service. The ladle of broth hitting the crisped skin, the sound it made, the way the steam rose from the plate, the 30 seconds during which the dish existed in its perfect form before the skin softened completely and it became something slightly different from what it had been. One of the 4 people interviewed, a woman named Sylvia Mandelbaum, who had grown up on Kingsbridge Road and left the Bronx in 1958 for a house in Levittown, said that the specific sound of the broth hitting the hot skin, a sound she could not describe in words but demonstrated by pressing her lips together and releasing air, was the sound she heard in her mind when she thought about Friday nights in the Bronx, more than any other sound from that time, more than the elevated train, more than the voices of her parents, more than the synagogue on Friday evening. A sound from a ladle of broth hitting a piece of chicken in a deli on Kingsbridge Road that nobody can name with certainty. That is what is left of that dish. That is what is left of that Friday night. That is what is left of that version of that life, and it is both nothing and everything, and Sylvia Mandelbaum died in 2003, and the sound she demonstrated for the researcher in 1991 was not recorded on tape, only described in the researcher's notes, and the notes are in a box in the Bronx County Historical Society, and the box has not been opened in 11 years. If you are over 70 and you grew up in the Bronx, and there is a dish you remember from a deli or from a Friday night kitchen that you have never heard described anywhere, please go to the comments right now. Not the recipe, the memory, the sound if there was a sound, the smell if there was a smell, the specific detail that has stayed with you for 60 years and that you have never found a way to explain to anyone who was not there. Leave it here. This channel reads every comment. What you leave here may be the only surviving account of something that actually happened. And actually happened, things deserve to be recorded. Even imperfectly, even late, even in a comment section on the internet in a year that would have been unimaginable to the people who ate on Kingsbridge Road on a Friday night in 1952. Concourse Village sweet potato tzimmes knish, the fusion preparation that emerged in the Concourse Village neighborhood in the early 1950s, when the delis serving the densely populated apartment blocks around the Grand Concourse began producing a knish filled with a mixture of sweet potato, dried prune, a small amount of honey, and cinnamon, the tzimmes filling repurposed as a knish filling, the logic being that the same ingredients that worked in the long braised sweet dish worked enclosed in dough and baked, and that the customers who had been eating tzimmes on Friday nights for 30 years might appreciate finding its flavors in a format they could eat, standing at the counter at 11 in the morning. The dough for this knish was a standard potato knish dough, which worked against the sweetness of the filling in a way that was intentional. The savory dough provided the neutral enclosure that allowed the sweet-spiced filling to be the entire flavor experience without the dough competing. At one deli on the Grand Concourse, whose name appears in accounts as either Silverman's or Silberman's, the uncertainty itself a symptom of the incompleteness of the record, this preparation cost 9 cents in 1955 and was made only on Thursdays. Why Thursdays specifically is not recorded. Thursdays was simply when it appeared, and the regulars who wanted it knew to come on Thursdays, and the information about Thursdays was transmitted the way all essential neighborhood information was transmitted in those years, by being told in person, by someone who already knew, to someone who had just moved to the neighborhood and needed to know, in the continuous human chain of local knowledge that made dense urban communities function and that cannot be replicated in any suburb where the neighbor is a stranger. Bronx deli egg barley soup, the preparation in which toasted egg barley, the small pasta shaped like grains of barley and sold at every Lower East Side grocery, was added to a chicken broth that had been enriched with the schmaltz from the week's rendering, with caramelized onion, and with a small amount of dried mushroom that had been soaked and chopped and added with its soaking liquid. The toasting of the egg barley before it entered the soup, done in a dry pan over medium heat until the pasta had gone from pale yellow to golden and smelled faintly of cooked grain, changed the flavor and texture of the finished soup in a way that untoasted egg barley could not produce. The toasted pasta held its structure through the simmering rather than swelling into softness, and it contributed a nuttiness to the broth that the untoasted version did not. At Zimmerman's Delicatessen in the Fordham section of the Bronx, egg barley soup made this way cost 9 cents a bowl in the late 1940s and was the lunch of choice for the elderly men who occupied Zimmerman's back tables from 11 until 2 on weekdays, playing cards and arguing and consuming, in aggregate, a quantity of egg barley soup that Zimmerman's son later calculated, in a memoir written for his grandchildren and never published, must have represented 40% of the deli's weekday lunch revenue. Zimmerman's closed in 1972. The son's memoir, which contains the toasting detail and several other preparation specifics, is in a box in his granddaughter's apartment in Fort Lee, New Jersey. She knows it exists. She has not read it. She is planning to. The Bronx that produced these dishes is not the Bronx that exists today. And the difference between the two Bronxes is not a story about change or time or the inevitable transformation of urban neighborhoods. It is a story about a specific set of decisions made by a specific set of people. Robert Moses, the highway engineers, the housing authorities, the banks that redlined the neighborhoods that remained after the displacement, that destroyed a community of 600,000 people with a speed and a completeness that left the delis those people had sustained standing empty on streets that no longer contained the people they had been built to serve. The food that those delis made was the food of that community, refined by that community's specific density and continuity and expectation. And it died when the community was dispersed, not because the recipes were lost, and not because the cooks forgot what they knew, but because food of that specificity requires a community to sustain it, and the community had been taken apart by forces that had never considered what the taking apart would cost. What it cost is what this video has been documenting. The cost was a sound, a ladle of broth hitting hot chicken skin on a Friday night on Kingsbridge Road. The cost was a Thursday knish on the Grand Concourse. The cost was a vanilla egg cream made from house-prepared syrup on East Tremont Avenue. The cost was every item on this list, and every item not on this list, and the entire cuisine of a neighborhood that was extraordinary and is gone, and the going was not inevitable, and the people who caused it did not pay the price of it, and the people who paid the price of it deserve to have it named. Find the oldest person in your family who has any memory of the Bronx, of those neighborhoods, of those streets, of any of those delis. Call them this week, not after this video, this week. Ask them one question. What did you eat? And where did you eat it?
Why didn't you share
And
them?
who was there? Write down what they say. Then come back to this comment section and leave what they told you. Not as a tribute, as a record, as the one act that remains available to anyone who understands what was lost and refuses to let the losing be the last word. The Bronx made food that existed nowhere else on Earth. It made that food because the people who lived there were who they were and lived the way they lived and ate together in rooms that no longer exist. The rooms are gone. The people are almost gone. What they remember is still here, right now, in the only place it has ever been, in the bodies of the people who were present when it happened. Ask them before you can't. Write it down before it's gone. Bring it back here. This channel is listening.